sorry. No, it's okay. And will you also touch on the report that you guys just did?
Sure. Thank you all for being here today, and if I'm not projecting, please just let me know. I guess in talking from local to the global and making that connection, I'm going to focus mostly on Islamophobia and the war on terror, and kind of talk a little bit about the Sikh narrative and how we fit into this. So going back, using a case that we brought up to the European Court of Human Rights, this was in about 2005-2006, when the hijab ban had come in 2004, as was discussed earlier, but the collateral impact of the hijab ban was on Sikhs. And in France, at the time when we raised the issue with them, they're like, you guys even exist? They had no clue who we were, that we actually lived in that country for hundreds of years, that we actually fought in World War II to defend the French. They had no clue. So we raised the issue, and we were given certain assurances and promises that, you know, this is directed. They clearly stated that this is directed towards Muslims. Basically, the idea is that the hijab somehow is an intimidatory article of faith, that it will intimidate others, whether of the Muslim faith or not of the Muslim faith. And so we actually countered this. We actually went to rallies with Muslim groups against the ban. So what was told to us was eventually completely ignored. And we had to basically take the French Supreme Court decision to the European Court of Human Rights. And what happened is, the court didn't even bother to look at it. They denied it on admissibility. Now what that is the court was using a doctrine, and I apologize, I'm going to go a little bit into international law, and I'll try to be as clear as possible. But they used a doctrine called the margin of appreciation. And I want you guys to see how this works for religious minorities versus how it works for religious majorities. So the margin of appreciation doctrine essentially says that if there is no consensus within European nations on a particular civil human rights issue, then the state itself would be granted that margin of appreciation based on its own history and tradition. So for France, being a secular nation, that was part of its history and tradition. So the court essentially was saying that they had the right to have their secularism, in a sense, in public schools, ban the hijab. Basically, they were saying their secular identity was so strong that we have to side on the French side and uphold this ban. But now look, just recently, 2010, Italy had the same situation. European Court of Human Rights comes up. The issue was on a cross in schools. Now this seems like more of a clear-cut violation, right? But what happened? Margin of appreciation again was invoked. Because Italy has a history and tradition of being faith-based, right? The Italian Christian tradition is very strong there. So where does the court come out on? Comes out on the side of the majority. Which means that if there is no consensus in European society, that means every European state who comes out and starts to ban religious identity in some form or fashion, we're going to lose in every single state because the margin of appreciation will never be on our side. So this doctrine I've written about is a very powerful doctrine, and it basically allows the court to not take a definitive stand on what's right. It allows them to kind of shift that burden to the states. And that's not what a court of last resort should do. That is absolutely unfathomable to me. So what we're trying to do is, what's the legacy, what's the impact of this? And so we're starting to see those things in TSA. So Transportation Security Agency recently passed policies that say, if you wear extra religious identity, and if for some reason the machine, which is the AIT, Advanced Imaging Technology, or a TSO, Transportation Security Officer, deems it to be non-form-fitting or bulky item, it means you're automatically subjected to multiple levels of screening. Now this doesn't matter if you don't trigger the metal detector. This doesn't matter if you trigger the AIT machine. You're automatically subject to secondary and sometimes even tertiary screening. And what happens when you have that? Imagine when you go into a metal box, right? You have the glass box that they have at the airports. I asked a group of Methodists that we were talking to about interfaith dialogue, and I'm like, who do you normally see in that box? They're like, people like you. I'm like, yeah. What does that inform the community, the broader community, when they see individuals like me always in these metal boxes? In these glass boxes. It can never be a good thing to be in a box, whether it has bars or whether it's either plexiglass. I mean, it's just a small anecdote. You know, me and my wife were at the airport. I was in that box as usual, getting really upset. I'm really calm 99% of the time, but you put me in a box and somehow I lose it. I had this little girl staring at me, and that moved me deeply to know. I could see in her eyes that she was already forming thoughts. That what is this man doing in this box? So it's broader than just being put in a box, being secondarily screened, broader than national security. It's what is the impact when you go outside? What is the impact when those people carry it into their schools? What are they teaching their children? So we see bullying at an unprecedented rate. We're talking about for Sikh boys at almost 70%. The national average is about 1/3. We see hate crimes. We've seen recently just 3 or 4 hate crimes against the Sikh community in the last 4 months. 2 in Sacramento, 1 in Atlanta. So this is not merely something that happens at the airports. It's not merely about national security. It impacts the broader, not just local society, but even global society. So now, connecting it back to Europe again, the EU passed similar legislation in 2010 that basically changed their screening policies from metal detectors, primary, to hand searches. Now what's happening with the hand searches? These individuals aren't trained properly. They're not given religious or cultural sensitivity trainings. So what they're doing is, whenever a person comes through in there, through the metal detector, if there is no metal detector, they're going to get patted down. So they start patting down the turban. That's deeply offensive to a Sikh. And I'm sure it's deeply offensive to a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, to have their article of faith, their identity touched in that manner. So what we're seeing in Europe is not only are the turbans being patted down, but they're asked also to be removed. So it doesn't matter if you pass through any security, primary security undeterred, you still have to remove it because they are not comfortable with those with external identities proceeding forward. And what's happened because of that? The Sikhs have actually stopped flying in Europe, a lot of them. They actually take the train instead. Their freedom of movement, fundamental right, under ICCPR Article 12, freedom of movement is a fundamental right. Under EU legislation, one of the fundamental freedoms that the EU system was built upon was freedom of movement. And when you stop to impede people, when you racially, religiously profile people, when you strip them of their dignity, their privacy, their modesty, and then you say, oh, it's your choice, you decided not to fly. Well, it's not. You've taken away our choice. And so, in essence, that's what we're seeing as the legacy, in Europe at least, from that type of Islamophobia. And we are the collateral impact of that. Just recently, and I'm going to allude to the report that we just presented at the UN, we do an annual report. It's our 3rd annual report focused on global civil and human rights issues. So what we're trying to identify there, and a few of the findings was, as I mentioned, that bullying occurs at a staggering rate for our children, at about 68% for Sikh boys. Secondary screening, we did a global survey. So it's not just the US where Sikhs are being screened at 100%. We looked globally and we found that anyone who has an external religious identity, whether they're wearing a turban or a headscarf, or a patka, which smaller Sikh boys wear, they were secondarily screened at 86%. It's not a US phenomenon. And then we start to look at statistics based on who keeps their articles of faith, adults versus children. The adults have it at a pretty high rate, the children have dropped off. Now what's going to happen when you're constantly put in a glass box and treated as suspect? When you're being bullied and harassed every single day? And you heard Hansdeep talk about some of the serious bullying incidents in terms of turbans being lit on fire, being punched in the eye with a key. What's going to happen to our children? Why would they want to maintain, how can they maintain an identity when they have to face these serious issues? I'm going to leave it at that.
Well, thank you so